Hi, this is Gary Sokolow. I will be your host today on this fourth webinar in the series for the 2014 Transportation Site Impact Handbook. In this webinar, we'll go over the third portion of Chapter 2 of the Site Impact Handbook. But before I get started, I just want to make sure that everyone sees the title screen that says Transportation Site Impact Handbook, and it has a picture of me. If so, could you raise your hands? I just want to make sure. Okay, good. I'm seeing some raising hands. Okay, I'm gonna put them down. That's good. And just for future reference, if you could hear everything we were talking about and when we were getting ready, would you raise your hands, please? All right. Well, Michael said he could. Yeah. So I think that might answer the question on one of the drawbacks of starting from the control panel. But anyway, hey, sorry, I appreciate the input on there. Today's focus will be large-scale travel forecast modeling. Here in Florida, we use a standard model called FSUTMS, which stands for, and I have to look this up every time, I shouldn't admit to that, Florida Standard Urban Transportation Model Structure. Okay, you may wonder how we got a name like that, and anybody that has been on here knows that that there are some advantages to have been at the department as long as I have, and don't think that this FSUTMS came about by accident. One of the original forefathers of the modeling program wanted to honor his alma mater and found a way to put FSU in it, and just wanted you to know a little bit of history there. Chapter 2 is the largest chapter of our handbook. It is the transportation technical side of the handbook, and that's why we've had 3 sections on this chapter. We may even have more, but they will come after the scheduled series, because there are other things that I believe that we might want to go into a little bit more detail. Now, who we have here today, these are many people who helped us write the handbook and update it. We're here to talk about what's new in the handbook and also to answer your questions if possible. We have Gina Bognani from DOT and Andrew Young from DOT. Our guest speaker today is somebody who had a large impact in updating the handbook on the modeling section, Roberto Miquel of CDM Smith and Nathan Hicks from CDM Smith here. Roberto has, as I said, he's helped us with updating the handbook and knows quite a bit about our modeling process. Though we do not all have formal speaking parts, we're all here. Matter of fact, we even have somebody who's not pictured here, who is also our in-house expert on the model, who's been working on it for many, many years, Terry Corkery, and perhaps there'll be some questions he can answer also as a panelist. So when you ask questions, we're all available here to help. At DOT, we've been providing and rewriting this handbook since 1997. There have been a lot of changes. However, as I've said many times, the principles of site impact have not really changed. One thing that hasn't changed since 2010 is that our website for downloading this handbook, the address is not changed. It's FDOT, TransportationImpactHandbook.com. Okay. Before we go any further, I'd like to get some idea of who's out there, and I'm going to have a poll here, and I'm going to ask you who you represent, and we'll get an idea. All right. It's been around 30 seconds, and the majority of you have answered, so I'm going to close this, and I'm going to share the information with you. And as you can see, we're evenly paired between local and regional governments, such as MPOs, regional planning councils, and consulting firms. We have a percentage of people here from Florida DOT and a number of people who are just representing themselves also, and I'm really pleased to see that. It means that they're on for educational purposes or for the purposes of future employment. So I'm going to close this poll and move on. Hey, listen, for those of you that have been with us from the start, I apologize for this repetition that we have, but I feel it's important for any of the new people that we're on. Once you go to the website at FDOT Transportation Impact Handbook, you'll be given a choice to download the PDF document. Simply hover your mouse and right mouse click over the Save Target As, and you will download the document to your computer. When you open the handbook, you will see that in the PDF version, it opens up with bookmarks over here, which make it very easy to navigate to the parts of the handbook you want. We do understand that this handbook is not really, we didn't create it that you would look and read through it from page 1 to the end. If you did, you're a better person than most of us. So we try to make things easier to find. Okay. We began page numbering on the cover. This means that the page numbers on the document are the same at the top as the top and the bottom of your PDF screen, your Adobe Acrobat screen, like that. This makes it a lot easier because when we tell you to go to page 134, you don't have to scroll around looking for the page 134 there. You can just simply put it into that part of the controls for Adobe Acrobat and go right to it. Okay, I have another poll that I would like to see. How many of our the past 4 webinars have you attended? To get an idea here, I am opening it. All right, I'm going to close the poll right now since most of you had voted. It's a little less than a minute, and I'm going to share it with you. And as you can see, the majority, well, not the majority, but the greatest number in these categories have been for all 4 webinars. I'd like to thank you very much for sticking with us. We got people who have been for 3, so 3 or 4 webinars have been the majority. You can see there who came to 2 and who's been to 1 other, and around 20%, this is their first time, and I'd like to welcome you. Thank you. As in most professional technical documents, we do need to make you aware that transportation impact analysis is as much an art as it is a science. Well, actually, it might be more of an art. That being said, we put a caveat at the bottom of every page that I'd like you to read. And what it says is, we have tried to have the most up-to-date information. However, due to changes in legislation and acceptable practice, we recommend you check with the links in the handbook. We've tried to put lots of links in there so you can get to the information that is the most up-to-date. And we did that on purpose because many of the websites are more up-to-date than a static book. However, currently there are discussions in our staff right now on how we're going to update the current handbook, and one of the easiest ways for us to do it is to just put, if you're familiar with it, comments and notes in a standard PDF format so you can see, we can report to you on changes. We have not done that yet, but we were looking at, because there have been a few changes since we published last year. Last week we looked at trip generation, and so those of you who weren't there for it, we do have it posted on our YouTube channel. And we looked at some of the trip generation studies that have been done by Florida DOT since 2010. We're quite proud of it. We're probably one of the most active states now in doing independent trip generation research, where we looked at variety stores and large convenience stores with gas stations and distribution centers. We also took an interest and discussed last time about the issue of internal capture in mixed-use developments. This was a report that was put out by it's a national report put out by NCHRP, the National Cooperative Highway Research Program. You will get links to all of these in our mail out to you. And so this was done in 2011. And in addition to that, we had the Center for Urban Transportation Research actually do a report comparing the research from the past, and they actually did trip internalization studies for 4 new places in Florida, therefore adding to the national database of knowledge, and came up with some more information. This is one of those subjects that I think we might have to have a separate webinar on at some later date. These are the links. When you get the handout, there'll be active links in there. We have what I call the Access Management Site Impact YouTube channel. These are links to the 3 last presentations. This is for Chapter 2, Part 1, and there's the YouTube link. This is for the overview. This is the one that we went over all 5 chapters very quickly. And this is the link to the last presentation we gave back in June on mostly on trip generation. So at this point, I would like to see if there are any questions. What's the YouTube channel? I'll tell you what I'm going to do so you can multitask, and I guess I'm not able to do that, right? Because I'm not doing it directly from my computer, and I apologize for that. You will get, when you get this printout, you will get a link to the channel, which has a lot of good things from access management, trip generation, site impact. The only problem we have that I consider right now is that since our webinars have been kind of long, the presentations are kind of long. We know we need to edit them and break them up into smaller, easier to view pieces. Any of you that can sit through an hour and a half of one of these really deserves to learn the material, and I do appreciate it. Well, today, as I said, is the third portion of Chapter 2, the transportation impact process, which is more of the technical nature of transportation planning for future impacts of future development. In the future, we're going to be covering Chapters 3, 4, and 5 on local government comprehensive plans, the developments of regional impact, or what we call DRIs, and last but not least, I'd like to cover the controversial and always changing subject of mitigation. Okay, the profession has really moved away from the simple, we'll just build new lanes every time the model calls for more traffic, or trip generation says that we're going to need more lanes. This is a time where we're trying to consider complete streets, concept of mobility fees, and increasing emphasis on the multimodal options, and it should continue to make our work a heck of a lot more interesting. So right now, what I would like to do is introduce Roberto Miquel. His specialties include travel demand modeling, long-range planning, evacuation modeling, data analysis and air quality modeling of vehicles. His experience is that he is a member of the AICP, American Institute of Certified Planners, has been with CDM Smith for over 8 years and has been in the profession for over 12 years. So with that, I am going to let Nathan hand over controls to Roberto, and welcome Roberto to our webinar.
Thank you, Gary.
Good to have you.
Glad to be here this afternoon with all of you. For this next portion of the webinar, we're going to be covering the use of transportation models and estimating impacts and solutions. We're going to focus on the set of models that are used in the state of Florida, the FSC-TMS that was mentioned earlier. We're also going to be talking about the differences between some manual methods and the use of the models and when each is appropriate. For now, I'd like to take a poll and just see what is your experience level of using FSU TMS? And I think.
Yeah, Roberto, I'll handle the poll, and let me get that, and I'll launch it. So, do you use FSU TMS model in your everyday work or rely on other professionals? So, okay, I'm going to close the poll right now since a majority of you have answered, and I'm going to share it with you. And what we see here are that 20% of you are actual FSU TMS, what I would consider experts. As I would expect, most of us rely, including myself, rely on others to do the programming, and there's a certain percentage of you that don't get involved in transportation modeling at all. So I'm going to hide the presentation, and I am going to let Roberto continue on.
Thank you. So it seems that, while some of you have a familiarity with FSU TMS and use it regularly, most of you either don't work with travel demand models or rely on others to do that for you. So this remaining portion of the workshop will be very good for all of you, if for no other reason than to provide you with a common set of vocabulary so that you can communicate with each other about what methods need to be employed and how they're being done. Our three main topics today will be manual versus model methods of determining traffic for site impact. Models as they are covered in the Transportation Site Impact Handbook, and then a detailed discussion on the models and methods using the model, including some discussion on a particular method that is not considered acceptable in the state of Florida. And we'll cover that so that you're aware of that method and know to avoid it. There will also be a section for questions at the end. So there are two main ways of determining site impact traffic. The manual method, where you use spreadsheets, you could even be down to the level of a worksheet, pen, paper, or calculator, and begin to make manual adjustments to trips as they emerge from the project site and travel along a network. The other method is to use a traffic model that automates a lot of that activity and does it on the computer for you. Each method has advantages that makes them more appropriate under certain circumstances. We hope that through this discussion you will come to recognize when it is more advantageous to use manual methods and when it is more advantageous to use the travel models.
Roberto. Sorry to interrupt. A few people are saying that they're having difficulties hearing. Are you able to turn your microphone up?
Let me see if I can get up to the microphone.
And the other thing that can be done on the end of the listener, and I know this from my own personal experience, is that sometimes that your volume is down.
So I'll just speak again and go ahead and comment if you're still having problems hearing me. Does it sound like we're doing better now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, good. And I apologize for that. I'm closer to the microphone, so hopefully that'll help. All right, so manual methods in general are better for smaller developments when you're not anticipating a very large number of trips, so less than 500 trips. And the rationale for that is that the effort involved in setting up a computer model just for such a small project may not be worth doing the simple calculations by hand. It's for areas near the fringe of model boundaries where the models are not usually very well validated or calibrated, meaning that the model is more likely to have error at the fringes of the boundary, and so a manual process may be preferable to relying on the model. And areas where models are not available. So obviously if you're doing site impact for a project that is in a locale that is not covered by any one of the various travel demand models in the state of Florida, you might be better off using manual methods. With manual methods, traffic data such as segment volumes and turning movements can be used to establish the traffic pattern. So understanding how to move the trips manually along the roadway network can be based off of observed existing traffic patterns. Development traffic is then added to the background volumes to determine the future conditions. And you often have to use your judgment to fill in areas where you're missing data. So if you get to a part of the roadway network where there might be a series of driveways and there might be a key intersection, but you don't have turning movements collected or traffic volumes collected for that area, you may have to make a professional determination of what the attrition might be or what the turning movements might be based on your understanding of the area. So traffic models are generally better for developments that generate large volumes of trips. So if you're talking about large subdivisions or office campuses that are going to generate a lot of trips, calculating all of that by hand could be very time consuming. At that point, the time and expense of setting up the project and the traffic model could be advantageous. Instances where existing traffic patterns may be disrupted are also prime candidates for the traffic model. So if you're putting in especially a very large development on a green site where there's been no prior development, the impact of that new development may be completely out of line with what has historically been the situation in that area, and you may want to use a computer model to do that site impact for you. With modeling methods, the traffic patterns are adjusted based on the effect of the new trips. The computer will add the new trips into the transportation network based on the site location and then route those trips accordingly. The potential effects of the system can also be analyzed. If there are any improvements that have been programmed or are planned or expected to go in, those can be put in the traffic model as well to see how that affects traffic and congestion, and can be used to assist in determination of trip distribution, modal split, and trip assignments, all computationally intensive activities that could be quite time consuming if you're doing it all manually, especially for larger projects. So the standard modeling method used in the state of Florida is the Florida Standard Urban Transportation Model Structure, or FSUTMS. You might also hear some individuals refer to it as FSUTMS, just saying it out there as a word. So if you hear any of those, Florida Standard Urban Transportation Model Structure, FSUTMS, or FSUTMS, they're all referring to the same thing, which is a standard set of file formats, calculations, and methodologies for developing travel demand models or traffic models in the state of Florida. These models are used in all of the 26 MPOs in the state of Florida, and FSUTMS uses a software platform called Cube Voyager to actually run the calculations. It's very effective for site impact analysis when it's combined with non-model techniques. And what that means is that the best application of FSUTMS for site impact is a combination of some manual calculations and then using the traffic model, the computer, to do the heavy lifting for you. And that is the approach we will cover in more detail later on. Even when models are used, the trip generation for ITE is used as a reasonableness check and for adjustment. What this is saying is that the calculation of trips as they come from the travel demand model itself may not be adequate to the calculation of trips that you need for the project, because there's a number of incidental trips that go into and out of the site that are not captured by the kinds of surveys that are done to develop traffic models. So when you use an FSU-TMS model, you're going to want to still get your trip generation from ITE or similar methods used in the state of Florida. The models that we're discussing today are referenced throughout the handbook. For those of you who may not be aware when we're talking about models, we're not talking about individuals who pose wearing clothes or physical representations of large structures. We're talking about a mathematical representation of reality, a set of calculations and data meant to reflect behavior as it would occur out in the real world. In this case, we're talking about behavior of transportation, of travel, of persons living in your community. The Transportation Site Impact Handbook makes references to the use of models throughout Chapter 2, in particular in Section 2.4 under trip generation, and under Section 2.5 discussing the projecting of future conditions. So when you have access to the handbook, you can go specifically to those locations and get a more detailed treatment on appropriate model applications for site impact, the same information which we're covering today. It's also covered under 2.8 for trip assignment. If you notice, in each of these sections, manual methods are also discussed along with the models in themselves. The use of travel demand models are also covered in Chapter 4 for DRIs, and in particular under the discussion of the methodology meeting, establishing a methodology for DRI review, and what is and is not appropriate for that specific project or application. The DRI pre-application checklist ensures that the parties involved can reach an understanding on the software and techniques that will be used to conduct the impact analysis for that DRI. It is also covered under the project approach discussion on how to use the model, whether or not there is a model, which model will be used, which data sets will be used. Having consensus up front or an understanding up front of the exact condition of the models that are being used and the data sets that are being used will be crucial to allowing this process to go forward. Without that understanding, there could be complications. The fact is that models differ in their calculations from version to version, and also with respect to the socioeconomic data, the population and employment that are used as the foundation for that model's calculation of travel behavior. So knowing up front which version of the model and which sets of data are being used, and also information concerning project build-out and other project-specific conditions will be crucial to successfully navigating the DRI process. So at this point, we'd like to open it up for any questions.
So, are there any questions out there? You can raise your hand.
There's one. Can you elaborate on model split, especially non-motorized trip, bike and ped, and transit trips, how the model predicts and with what accuracy? That's a very good question. I think we do touch on briefly on a little bit on mode choice, and the department does put on a much more extensive set of workshops and trainings that deal with this particular issue along with other travel demand modeling. But briefly, models can differ depending on which MPO or part of the state they are designed for. Some models may not have a mode split component. Other models do, and the quality of their mode split components depends on how rigorous those models are developed. So in areas such as Southeast Florida with the Tri-Rail, where transit is a strong consideration, that mode split model is better developed than, say, models for Tallahassee, which do have some mode split components, and certain versions of those modes, but because they only have a local bus system, it's not as rigorously defined. The accuracy of mode split with these models will depend on how well the models are calibrated, and that information will be covered in that particular model's discussion on its development. And I think that's as far as we should go for this webinar.
Can
Are there
I,
any other
yeah,
questions?
this is Gary and Gary Socolow, and there is a discussion earlier on in the handbook about the role of mode split in large-scale models when it comes to planning for transit. And what we say in the handbook is that since this is a pretty new field of trying to determine, I won't say mode split, but transit usage, bicycle usage, pedestrian activity, that the practice today is if your community wants to provide better amenities and a better system for transit, pedestrian, and cyclists, a lot of times these require special studies and should not just depend on a mode split from a model, because it's more of a policy decision to encourage these multimodal options, and sometimes the model is not going to be sensitive to the fact that you have a community that's willing to put infrastructure and services in that may attract more people. So that was my 2 cents on it.
And Gary, there appears to be a follow-up question about where specifically in the handbook that discussion is.
I'm sorry, I can't tell exactly where it is without doing a search on it right now. But as I said, it's not a large discussion on it, but it is one of the reasons that we moved away from the 1997 version of the handbook into 2010 and 2014. We had everything, all the steps based on the essential 4-step modeling process. And what we decided was to move away from that and say that there's more to predicting and developing a transportation future than just modeling what we've done in the past. So it's in there. I will try to find where that discussion is. On the other hand, that discussion is pretty short, but it explains why that in 2010 and 2014 we moved away from more of an auto-centric traffic circulation study to more of a transportation and that's why it's called the transportation impact rather than just the traffic impact handbook like it used to be. We're trying to get away from, okay, it says only 2% of the people are using transit, let's not worry about it. Because that's not the way
Gary,
a number of communities are working. Go ahead.
Gary, this is Terry Corkery. If I could just add something real quickly, we don't want to get too bogged down in this, but in my experience, the transit question is handled more in the mitigation phase. Remember, we're trying to kind of deal with a worst case when we're initially identifying the traffic impacts, and that during mitigation, the reviewing agency can often extract some design changes from the developer, such as making some right-of-way available for a bike path that might continue through that development, and in return they would allow them to discount some of the vehicle impacts and say that a certain percentage of those would be satisfied through bicycle trips, or to move a shopping center closer to the edge of the street rather than having a gigantic parking lot between the edge of the street and the front of the building, so that would encourage pedestrian and transit usage by moving those storefronts to the street, making it more walkable. So that's why we try to reserve that towards the mitigation phase and not just assume that a certain high level of transit, pedestrian, or bicycle trips would somehow just emerge on their own.
Correct. And Gina found the page in which this was mentioned, and that's page 72 of the handbook, where we do talk about mode split and alternative travel forecasts. And the example that we give, just the one that we know of here, is called it's called TBEST, T-B-E-S-T dot, which is a model developed for our transit division, and it is quite data intensive. It takes a look at pedestrian access to buses, and of course looking at not only the frequency of the buses but where they go. To make a long story short, it probably could tell you how to get a 10% modal split, but it tells you that you would need to have, in some cases like Tallahassee, you would need to have 10-minute headways and more routes. So that is, this is just a big part of the change in our profession. And as Terry said, a number of communities have already started to, in their mitigation process, ask for contributions to either rapid bus transit system or amenities to that system. So thank you, Terry.
Okay, I know there's another question out there. Hopefully I can fold it into this discussion going forward, but in the interest of time, I think we'll need to move forward for now. If we can, we'll get back to some of these other questions and comments. So we're going to,
Yeah, that one has already been done. I apologize. I combined both those poll questions into one. And so if we're running short on time, we can go to the next. Thank you. Sorry, Roberto.
Oh, that's all right. So now we're going to have a more detailed discussion on the traffic models, and specifically discussing the difference between FSU-TMS's trip generation and ITE, replicating ITE trip generation in the model, and various FSU trip assignment methodologies. So trip generation from FSU-TMS versus ITE. The question then becomes, which one is better for site impact analysis? They have their pluses and minuses, but it's important to understand what it is that FSU-TMS is trying to accomplish versus ITE. FSU-TMS models are regional travel demand models, typically developed for the benefit of an MPO, a Metropolitan Planning Organization, for the purpose of conducting region-wide travel and replicating regional patterns to allow for long-range regional transportation planning. The calibration of the model is set to average conditions over link volume to count, large districts to districts, to make sure that the overall pattern of behavior adequately represents what is happening in that region. It is not calibrated to zone-specific traffic volumes, whereas ITE trip generation practices are set to develop or come up with the exact number of trips that you can expect to be generated by a specific project at a specific location. It's this difference between the generality of the FSU-TMS model and the specificity of the ITE model which distinguishes them from one another, such that the ITE will calculate the average number of trips generated by very specific land uses, whereas FSU-TMS models calculate what are known as productions and attractions to very general levels on very generalized land uses, which may at times not have much of a bearing on the specific use you are trying to measure. On top of that, the model from FSU-TMS will also make adjustments on attractions, which are the types of trips which are generated at the employment end of the trip. So if you're doing a site impact for a large shopping area or a large business park or some other type of activity, FSU-TMS will adjust the trips coming out of the model up or down in order to make it match on a regional level with the number of productions coming out of people's homes. Whereas with ITE, you can specifically determine how many trips should be coming to and leaving from that development that you're looking at. In this way, the ITE trip generation is a more applicable practice for determining the number of trips for your project. So what is FSU-TMS good for? Its key strengths are on those computationally intensive processes we discussed earlier, trip distribution and trip assignment, figuring out where all those trips that are being generated want to go and which roads those trips are going to take to get there. It's also very useful for developing the non-development trips, or the general traffic occurring in the region that are not specific to your project. So instead of having to go throughout the entire region and manually calculate the trips for every single parcel or development out there, you can use the FSU-TMS model to help develop what's going on in the rest of the region so that you can focus your attention on what's happening at the project site. The best modeling method for site impact then is a combination of these two techniques, using FSU-TMS for trip distribution and assignment, but using ITE methods to develop the number of trips coming from the development. So then, seeing that we want to use ITE trip generation in conjunction with the model, how do we integrate these two approaches? There are two basic methods that we'll discuss. Both of these have strengths and weaknesses, but either of them are adequate to the task. The first method listed here is the link volume factor method. And with the link volume factor method, you use the FSU-TMS model pretty much out of the box, and you will modify the zone data input file, which contains the population and employment data for the model, to be as similar to the characteristics of your project as possible. Since I mentioned earlier, the FSU-TMS models discuss developments very generally and not very specific with respect to land use, your data that you're going to be putting in may not be as specific as they would be for ITE. However, the benefit here is you can let the whole model run with data in its own formats and its own numbers, and when it's done, you will receive a set of factors, or you will calculate a set of factors of trips traveling from the site throughout the region, and then you can apply those factors to the trips generated at from the ITE method, and we'll discuss that in more detail later. The second method, special generator method, uses the model's SpecGen input file, which is a file that allows you to actually manually input the number of trips. You can then take the number of trips that you've calculated using the ITE methodology, place that into the special generators file, and run the model with the ITE trips exactly matching or very close matching what they should be. The problem with this, or the greatest weakness with this, I should say, is that the special generator method is subject to that effect we were talking about a little bit earlier, where the trip attractions can be adjusted up or down in the model. This means that in order to actually achieve the target of generating the number of trips that ITE is producing, you may have to run the model several times, each time adjusting the number of trips in the special generator file in order to achieve the number from ITE. So the link distribution percentages method is based on, as I mentioned earlier, inputting the appropriate data into the model in its FSUTMS format and allowing the model to run on its own. In order to do this...
Just a second, Roberto, I just want to mention the link distribution percentage method is what you called the volume factor method in the previous slide. We kind of changed the names there along the way.
Yes, thank you, Terry, for catching that. I'm sorry, I thought we had caught all those. Apparently we did not. If that occurs again later in the slides, just please keep in mind that link volume factor and link distribution percentage both refer to the exact same process. Thank you. So in this case, you would take your type of development that you're doing the impact for, and you would input employment or a population as is appropriate based on sources from ITE or the Urban Land Institute. These are some very typical employee per 1,000 square foot rates that could be used. So if you have an office building that, or an office location that's 10,000 square feet, you would take 4 office employees per 1,000 square foot. That would give you 40 office employees, and you would then put those 40 employees in the appropriate location in the model's zone data file. You would then, after having done that, accounting for all of your development, run the FSUTMS model run. Here are some more standard rates for converting dwelling units, number of dwelling units to population, or amount of square foot to numbers of employees, or in the case of hotels, number of employees based on how many rooms the hotel has. So the idea behind the link volume factor or link distribution percentages method is that as the model assigns trips from the project site onto the roadway network, onto the transportation system, those trips will begin to divert through the network as they come to intersections. They will make turns, going left, right, straight ahead. And the goal of this method is to determine on any given link of the network, what is the percentage of the development's traffic on that link. So the percentage of the development traffic on a given roadway segment or model link as a percentage of the total external generation of that project. So, for example, I'm sorry, before we get to the example. Once you know what that percentage is, you will then apply those percentages to the ITE trip generation in order to get the total number of ITE trips on that specific link. Now, so for example, you take the FSUTMS model, we put in our equivalent IT development characteristics, the square footage converted to employment, or the dwelling units converted to population into the FSUTMS model. We run the model, and we see, for instance, as the trips leave the development, in this case, 1,000 trips leaving the development, 700 will head east, and 300 will head west. From that, we can determine that 70% of the project's trip, of the site's trips, will head east, and 30% will head west at that location where the project meets the roadway network. We then take our IT calculations, which in this case would be 1,500 trips, and we apply that 1,500 to each of these factors. So 70% of 1,500 is 1,050 trips heading east, and 30% of 1,500 is 450 trips heading west. You would then continue this throughout the rest of the network, past every intersection, until you get to a point where the number of trips from the project have essentially petered out. Now, another question that often comes up with the use of FSUTMS models is whether they're useful for calculating internal trips. And the answer to that is that the FSUTMS models can be used as a guide to help you in the manual calculation of internal trips, but should not be used exclusively for that purpose. There are a lot of considerations to keep in mind with FSUTMS. A project, a site, a development in FSUTMS, as we've mentioned before, is highly abstracted. It's very generalized. And so it does not allow for the adequate or accurate calculations of interactivity, interactions or trip movements within the TAZ, or the traffic analysis zone, that contains the data for the project. Because of this, the model has a very limited ability to determine the compatibility of land uses on site, and may not give you a very accurate understanding of internal capture. Because of this, developing a process for determining internal capture consistent with recommended ITE processes and what is negotiated during the review and meeting process during the site or DRI impact analysis activity will be crucial to calculating internal trips. So FSUTMS trip assignment, since this is one of the best uses of FSUTMS, so we have a better understanding of what it is that FSUTMS does in terms of assignment, is FSUTMS is based on a capacity-restrained equilibrium assignment routine. What that means is that using the constraints of the capacity of the roadway network, FSUTMS will divert trips in response to congestion throughout the network until it achieves a state of equilibrium where no further adjustments on the network can be made in order to ensure that all travelers have as optimal a travel time as possible. This, in short, means that FSUTMS allows you to really take into account the effects of congestion when you're assigning your site trips onto the network. Once you've done the FSUTMS assignment, you would then use a tool or a process known as selected zone analysis. And what this does is it tracks the number of trips traveling from your specific site or project in the model and identifies which specific links on the network those trips take. So whether you're using the link percentage distribution method or the special generators method, you will still need to identify which links those specific trips are going to. And then your background traffic is your total trips minus your development trips. However, you may need to check against observed data to make sure that the results from the model in that respect are reasonable. So the way you do the selected zone analysis, you will run the FSUTMS model, again, either using the link volume factor method or using the special generators method, both of which are detailed in the Site Impact Handbook. You will then display the traffic that enters and exits development zone on the loaded network using the model's path file, which is a specific output from the model that you can set up to report on just the trips coming from your development. And then you would save the development traffic onto the highway network as a new attribute for further analysis. So your highway network stores data and attributes, and one of those pieces of data are the volumes traveling on the network. You can also place the volumes specifically attributed to the development as a separate attribute on that network so that you can then compare where those trips are going. And then check for reasonableness. So here's an example of using a cube path file. Let us assume that the trips we're interested in, our development is in TAZ9, zone 9. It's also represented in the model as a network node, in this case node 9. You would use this tool to conduct the selected zone analysis for all trips passing through, entering, or leaving that specific node. And in response, what you would get is a graphic which will show all the trips from that zone as they travel the network. The thicker the bandwidth, the more trips from that particular zone are on that link. The thinner the bandwidth, the fewer the trips. You can also post those volumes on specific links. And you can also save these volumes onto the highway network file so that you can do all the calculations using the computer to determine what the link volume factor should be, or to determine how much of your zone special generated trips are on each link. Now we're going to discuss briefly a particular methodology that is not desirable or even permitted in the state of Florida, and how it compares to this selected zone method that we're discussing now. So the selected zone analysis allows you to do a single model run with the total trips and the development trips, and you are then able to track the specific trips from that site throughout the network, and those trips are diverted on the network in response to the congestion it encounters throughout the region as far as those trips will travel. What this means is that you're allowed to track the full extent of trips emerging from the site. The other method, with and without methodology, does two separate model runs, one with the project coded into the model and one with the project not coded into the model. The volumes from the project or the results of volumes from the version of the model without the project coded in are then subtracted from the volumes with the project coded in, and the result is something which is called a net impact, or with the project and without the project, what is the difference in traffic volume. This problem, this particular method has a problem in that because of how the capacity restraints of the model operate and with equilibrium, there can be a situation where you will have virtually no registered impact in the network because of trip diversion. And oftentimes, the response to this may be, so what, diversion occurs in the real world, and that I should only be responsible to mitigate the net impacts of the development. So after all of the congestion has been rooted out by the model, after the model has found an optimal solution, only then should I be held responsible for anything that might be left over. And so, for example, you might have a development which places 10,000 trips onto the network, resulting in 50,000 trips going in one or 50,000 trips on one link heading west, and 45,000 trips heading east. So that includes not just the trips from the development, but also the trips that are already occurring from other projects, developments, or just existing development in the network. And then the second scenario without the development, so 0 trips are being added onto the network, and so you get 48,000 trips in each direction. Those are just all traveling through there, not being affected from the development. And the result would be in the western link, 50,000 trips with the project, 48,000 trips without the project, so you have a net of 2,000 trips. But in the other direction, 45,000 trips with the project, 48,000 trips without the project, or negative 3,000 trips for a net impact of 0. This was quite a few years ago challenged, and there was a ruling that you could not use this method, that the DRI process specifically requires accounting for all trips caused by the development. So each developer is responsible not for the total or for the net impact onto the system, but they are responsible for the trips they specifically contribute to the system. And the rationale was that if all developers use the argument that trips are diverted and that net impact is negligible, no developer would be responsible for any mitigation, which is extremely counterintuitive. The case that's referenced is there on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, Westinghouse Gateway Communities et al. Versus Lee County Board of County Commissioner, January 14th, 1991. So this is important to keep in mind. If anyone comes to you and says what they want to do is they want to run a model scenario with the project and a model scenario without the project and just subtract the one from the other and see what the net impacts are, that with and without method is not accepted in the state of Florida as an adequate means of determining site impact. So in summary, the definition of identifying traffic volumes on each roadway link, we look at total traffic, which is the traffic on the link itself that the model is generating or putting onto the link. So if you run the model, you can look at the network itself, look at each specific roadway segment and get what the total volumes are, the total traffic. Development traffic, which is that traffic specifically emerging from the site. It is a direct result of that IT trip generation, or it's what you want to capture by that IT trip generation, and it's specifically the traffic coming from the development. And development at future analysis years. So models are developed for specific base years. They can also be developed for specific horizon years for planning. You may also need to develop a scenario or version of the model for different interim years that the regional model may not already have if you are specifically talking about opening and build out years that are not consistent with what the MPO model may already have. That might be a source of negotiation during the DRI application process or the site impact process, and there may be some room to use the existing model interim years and horizon years if they're close enough to the project years, or to allow for some form of adjustment so that a full, developing a full scenario at a completely different year may not be necessary, but that will have to be discussed during the discussions for developing the technical approach to the site impact analysis. So once you're done with your assignment, you will then have to determine whether or not any links are operating at adverse levels of service and carrying significant volumes of development traffic. So it's not just those links that are surpassing the accepted level of service thresholds for the site impact analysis, but those links in the model network which surpass that threshold and which carry a significant volume of development traffic. Further information on using FSUTMS models can be found on fsutmsonline.net, which is the web portal for travel demand modeling in the state of Florida. It contains information on the Florida Model Task Force and when it meets. The Florida Model Task Force is a meeting of public and private sector professionals engaged in the travel demand modeling practice in the state of Florida, and helps to set the state of the practice for the state and also advances in the state of the practice over time. It also contains information on upcoming FSUTMS training workshops if you would like to know more about how to use a FSUTMS model, or if you have staff that will be doing this work for you and you need them to know how to use the model, they can be sent to these workshops. They are held periodically throughout the year. There's also documentation on research projects and standard practices available on FSUTMSonline.net, and also technical support and information on modeling contacts with the Florida Department of Transportation for each of the Florida Department of Transportation's districts, along with the central office. And with that, we'd like to open it up to more questions.
This is Gary. I have noted that the FSUTMSonline.net does have information on the training workshops, but I wanted to let people know that as far as I'm concerned, some of the best online computer-based training that we've ever done is on the modeling, FSUTMS modeling, and I just texted that link to everybody in the audience. Do go to fsutmsonline.net. Look around, especially on the training portion, if you have interest into delving into this in a greater way, because as I said, they have online training. They have it like what they call the executive based, which is the overview, and they have a much more detailed based, and this is all computer-based training that they have. If there's any more training that Terry would like to people to know about, well, Terry, you can chime in, or in our post webinar email, we can send links and information on that too.
Now, Gary, we are just beginning a new fiscal year, and so I anticipate sometime in the next couple of months we'll come out with a new training schedule, and I believe we are going to do a DRI course, or a traffic impact analysis modeling course.
That's great. That really is great, because that fits right into what this is all about. And yeah, Terry and our staff in modeling over the years has done what they call the DRI modeling training, and it is specifically on the kind of things that Terry and Roberto have been talking about for the last 30-40 minutes.
As a matter of fact, he and I have been the instructors in the past, so
cool.
I imagine that'll continue.
Yeah, great. That's fantastic. right. Any other questions?
So
Hey,
we have, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we do have a question from earlier that I was not able to get to concerning when forecasting trips in a new development, how do you forecast increases in truck freight movement? It really depends on the model and the site. If you're dealing with a site in which accounting for those freight movements or those truck trips is crucial, then this has more of a bearing on you than if not. Some models have more sophisticated truck models, which go into a lot of detail to understand what those truck movements are. And in that way, you can start to look at the truck distribution of trips along the network, similar to how you do the other auto trips on the network. And then if you have a good sense of what an accurate truck generation should be for a particular site, apply that truck generation to the percentage of truck trips that the model is saying will go to each link, similar to the link volume factor method that we've discussed. Even models without very robust truck models will still have a commercial vehicle component, or usually has a commercial vehicle component, which would give you some guidance on how the model would route truck trips from your site. And again, any technique which you propose, can also be subject to manual adjustments. The key is to make sure you're upfront about your proposed methodology, and you have data available to support the methods you want to use. Another question was on determining when to use the model and the 500 trip threshold, whether that's peak trips or daily trips. In general, my understanding is the 500 trip threshold is more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule, and it's meant to give you a sense of what is a burden to do manually versus when you should just allow the computer to do it for you. And a lot of times, traffic engineers who are practiced in these manual methods will have a strong sense on whether or not the number of trips being generated are just going to be too difficult to do efficiently by hand. I don't know if the department has a specific guidance on whether that's intended to be peak trips or daily trips.
It's daily, but it's, again, as you said, not a hard and fast rule that we should say, okay, don't use the model this way or do use it this way. It's just a rough guideline.
Are there any other questions? Okay. What do you guys think about calculating proportionate share based on person carrying capacity / demand versus vehicular capacity / demand? I think that question is asking on whether or not the proportional share should be calculated based on how many persons are accessing the site versus how many vehicles are accessing the site. Is that? I'm not sure if maybe one of our department panelists might have a better idea.
I think Roberto, I think we're interested in vehicles with respect to site impact analysis, because we're trying to get at what the congestion will be, where the level of service is exceeded, and that the significance threshold is exceeded. In the case of DRIs, I think it's 5% of the LOS threshold. I mean, the maximum, what is it, the maximum volume at the adopted LOS service volume. Isn't that right, Gary? 5% of the max of all? There's a significance threshold?
That is, I believe if it is anywhere in rule or statute, it would just be for those developments of regional impact that are still considered DRIs, which are not that many.
Right, that's for DRIs, but for some local
local governments can do whatever they want, and so they historically have done everything from 2.5% to 10%. Local governments have quite a bit of discretion in how they consider what is significant, and especially since around 2011 when the growth management laws changed. I'm looking at the question, and the answer to the question is, what do we think about calculating proportionate share based on person carrying capacity over demand versus vehicular capacity over demand? And I don't think we have an opinion on that yet, especially since local governments do have the ability to create their own proportionate share or impact fee calculations based on methods other than what used to be tightly controlled by the state. And what you're mentioning, Masood, is probably one of those things that's being considered right now, and there will be other things considered, such as proportionate share, not proportionate share, I meant to say mobility planning or mobility fees that'll be completely, that will not be based on prop share, but will be based on future transportation needs and the proportion of those needs that they project to be part of that new development. And we're going into a completely different world, except for the fact that I believe today most local governments have stayed with their concurrency system they had before 2011. But you'll see some places moving into some new thinking on it. And maybe we can get into that more. As Terry said in the mitigation chapter, I'm starting to see that might be an interesting focus for our fifth chapter, and to discuss mitigation and some of the options that are out there today. All right. Well, thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you, Terry, for helping us out on this today. As you said, stay tuned for live training that they might be doing shortly, and really do appreciate the time and effort. Earlier today, somebody asked where our YouTube channel was, and I'm sending you a link to it. It's got a lot of material in it on access management and site impact, including our previous webinars, and it's got a lot more on it, and I'm not going to go into it right now. In our next webinar, we are going to discuss the review of local government comprehensive plans, and it's something that we at DOT have a responsibility to do. And here's our future webinars sessions. As we said, this is the local comp plans. We're going to have a webinar on DRIs, Developments of Regional Impact. And in October, we will have our session on mitigation. And really, we haven't prepared these presentations yet. And and that's why I'm particularly interested in some of the questions that you have asked, because it helps us mold the material to your needs. And so I do appreciate that. We, again, have some great free resources here. When you get the PDF version of this, these are all linked. We pride ourselves in having a lot of good information that is of no cost, and that we try to also provide training like this and technical assistance like this, so you can use some of this material that is quite technical. Before we leave, I'd like to find out how you found out about these webinars, to give an idea of how we should be promoting them. All right. I wish I had music I could play during this time that you guys are voting. All right. I am going to close the polls and show you what we got here. And most of you have found out about this through the FDOT contact mailer, and we will make sure that those of you that don't know about it can write us, and we can not only give you the link, but we can actually send you instructions on it. So keep that in mind. Keep in touch with us. The best way to get to us is through email. Feel free to send emails to more than just one or two of us, and we'll make sure that your questions get discussed and quite possibly even answered. We'd like to thank you for attending this presentation, and we really do appreciate you. And we should be able to send a copy of this presentation with all of its links sometime the next day or two, and we should have a recording of this within 1 or 2 weeks. All right, and what I would like to do is say thank you, and until next time, and I'm going to end the webinar right now. Okay, thank you again.